the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. This weekend for us in the United States is a weekend that we are invited to celebrate the life and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King was obviously a gifted preacher. He was an exceptionally talented teacher. He was a community activist of great accomplishment. He was a visionary, prophetic figure. But the role that he made manifest in his life that I think gets underplayed the most is the role that I most embrace of Dr. King. And it was really, truly his primary call. And that was, he was a pastor. He was a shepherd of souls. And as a pastor, he understood the wisdom that we heard from the first book of Samuel with the summons of Samuel to a prophetic call, and the wisdom of the gospel today as Jesus calls Philip to follow him as disciple, as apostle. Dr. King knew well that we encounter God, that we encounter Christ in the midst of community. And so it may not surprise you that my favorite quote of Dr. King, and we know volumes have been filled with his quotes, is when he said, "We will learn to live as brothers and sisters, or we will perish together as fools." Dr. King understood the importance of community, of witnessing one to another, as Philip did for Nathanael in today's gospel, that we give witness to one another. And that is what God uses to help us encounter the presence of God in our midst. It gives me great joy this morning to welcome up one of our own who will share a bit of her own story, who will witness for us the transforming power of God's grace made manifest through the ministry of St. Paul. Please join me in welcoming up Jane Van Gitch.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My husband and I moved to Delray Beach from Savannah, Georgia in 2005. The first thing that we looked for, actually, after buying our house, before we'd even moved in, was a church. And we knew we wanted to go to be, it had to be an Episcopal church. And so we came first to St. Paul's. We didn't have to go to any other one. That was what we wanted. And we always have felt a part here of the church. When we moved here, we were both in good health. My husband played tennis. He played singles on the local level and the national level. He had done very well. He was always sought after as a partner and someone to compete against. And then after about 3 or 4 years, my children pointed out to me that they thought that their father was slipping a little bit. And I didn't really believe it or want to believe it at first, because my answer to them was, well, you know, he's always been a bit of an airhead and he never knows where he's going, so it's not so unusual. But eventually I had to agree, and I had to take him to a neurologist, and the neurologist, after some kind of an examination, told me he probably has Alzheimer's, which was to me a deadly kind of diagnosis, because I'd already had a mother and a sister who had Alzheimer's. In any event, the first year or two were relatively easy. I certainly talk to people, the clergy at St. Paul's. Father Chip was here at the time. He told me to talk to Kathleen, who was extremely knowledgeable about what is available in the area and what choices I had, etc. And then our own Father David Angelica, gave a course on end-of-life decisions, which I attended and dragged my husband to. And it was extremely helpful. And I decided at that point I had to become very proactive. And I made sure that all of the things that I learned in this course that needed to be done got done. And we sort of petered along. And I decided that I could no longer run the household alone, because that's what I was doing. We had a house, we had maintenance, we had a pool. He no longer knew how to operate it. He couldn't get on the computer any longer. But by the way, all this time he was mellow and sweet. He was absolutely, he never wandered, etc. But I decided that probably we could live another 10 years like this, and that we ought to move into continuing care facility. And after investigating and getting recommendations, we moved to Abbey Del Rey South. We moved on the 7th of August. And he was fine with the move. And I put him in a class, to have memory kind of class there. And one morning in October, by that time he couldn't choose his own clothes, so I had laid out his clothes on his bed, and I said it was time for him to get up and to get ready, and I would bring him in his coffee. 2 minutes later, I came in and I found him stark naked on the floor, passed out. And I was so happy I was at Abbey, because I could pull a string, and immediately, I'm telling you, in less than 2 minutes, there was a registered nurse there. She couldn't revive him either, so she called for an ambulance, and she said she would take care of everything. All I had to do was to get my papers, etc., the care indications that I had signed and he had signed for his care. And I followed the ambulance at some distance, I might add, to the hospital, to Bethesda. And when I got there, the primary attending physician in the emergency room had already seen him, and he had called in a cardiologist. And the cardiologist was quite sure that there was some involvement of the circulatory system, the heart, or something. At that moment, my daughter, who lived nearby and was the reason that we moved here, that and her 4 children and wonderful husband, was there. And we all chatted with the cardiologist, and he had seen my husband alone. And so he said, I'm going to have him interned and we'll see what the problem is. Well, it turned out that the problem, and I said, my daughter said to me, I think we'd better call Natalie and Nick, my son and daughter, who one lived in New Hampshire, the other in Athens, Georgia. And I said, no, don't call them yet. It's too early. Don't want to worry them. And Natalie's on a business trip in Texas anyway. And she said, no, I think they'd better come, which they did that same night. And at that same time, we found out that he had 3 pulmonary embolisms, and that the cardiologist recommended that he have surgery as soon as possible, which he did the next day, and he spent about 10 days in the hospital. He recovered, but he was never as chirpy as he had been. Over the next 3 months, he collapsed 6 times, the last time on top of me. And each time Abby called, it was the same drill. They called the ambulance, and he was taken to a hospital. The last time I went to visit him, and I would stay the whole day, and the very last time that he was hospitalized. Late in the afternoon, dear Kathleen came in, and I said, Kathleen, please look at him. I've never seen him look so poorly. He looks awful. He was asleep. He seemed almost comatose. At that point, an aide came in and she said, excuse me, could you leave for a couple of minutes because I'm going to change him and change his bed. And Kathleen and I walked out to the corridor. Within, I would say, 1 minute, all hell broke loose. There were bells going off and people running to his room. He almost had no blood pressure when the aide attended to him. I don't know what I would have done if Kathleen hadn't been there. She was wonderful. Everybody at St. Paul's was wonderful. He did recover. While I called my daughter, who was coming in from a business trip, and she came immediately. I think Kathleen stayed with me until she came, but the nurse, the head nurse, came and said, you have to call your family. This may be the end for him. And she said, even if he survived, you need to call in hospice. He went into ICU and stayed for several days. And by the way, he was unresponsive most of that time. And one night, my daughter and son-in-law came to take me out to dinner at the hospital, and we were sitting with him. And Father Chip came in and said, let's pray. And we all held hands, and we prayed over him. And he awakened. And he was bright, as if nothing had ever happened. Well, he went back to Abbey Del Rey after that, and he was indeed in the nursing home part. He could no longer, and this happened in the space of about 3 or 4 months, he could no longer cut his food, then he could no longer lift a spoon or a fork. It was wonderful for me to be there because I could have every lunch and dinner with him, and I could feed him. Also, he had communion brought in. He was always quite responsive. But then he would go through periods where they call it the mask of Parkinson. He had a Parkinson's-related disease that we later discovered. And he would be, maybe sometimes for hours or days, it was like he wasn't there anymore. And he had been through one of these periods, and I'd gone out to have my hair cut after lunch. And on my way back, my phone rang, and it was my son. And he said, Mom, you know they've named a new pope. I said, okay. He said, he's from Argentina, and his name is Francis. My husband was from Argentina, and his name was Francis. I thought he was kidding me. I thought it was a joke. And finally, he insisted, and I went to Abbey. And when I got there, he was sitting up in his bed watching the news. And I said, oh, Francis, you know they've named a new pope. He said, yes, I know. His name is Francis, and he's from Argentina. That was one of the last times that he was really with it. A few days later, he got pneumonia. And it was Easter time, and I knew that the end was near. And I just hoped he wouldn't die on Easter, which he didn't do. And Easter Monday, again, he woke up, and I called my children, and I said, you won't believe it. It's Lazarus here. He's bright. He seems to have recovered. Even the nurse said, because he had round-the-clock nursing with hospice, she said, well, I think I could go home. The nurses at Abbey said, no, wait one more day. The next morning he died. We had that last day together. But I cannot tell you the comfort that I got from St. Paul's, from Father Chip, who was here at the time, especially from Kathleen, and especially the class that prepared me for what I had to go through. That's basically my story. And I'm eternally grateful to the support that I received from St. Paul's.